see you all here tonight. Glad to have you. And we are in week number 4 of the book of Job. Now, I've been told that I move around a little bit, so I have to kind of stay put where I am. So if you want to come closer, because I have a propensity to move in your direction if and when you ask a question or when you're talking, so I can hear you. I got some aids in my ears. So, and thanks to Larry and his lovely wife Jane, I now have new batteries tonight, so I can hear real well. All right, tonight we are studying the book of Job. Continuing so, we are in week number 4. Well, as we begin, we always have to keep in mind that hello, there we go. That Job was a man of unmerited suffering, and we often use him today as a typical example of how anyone who is a suffering servant. Last week we went through quite a bit of things, and tonight it's going to be even more so than last week, so I may be moving quickly, I'm not sure. But let's come and establish what we have already established in the book of Job from last week. We know Job had 3 friends. One of the friends' names was Eliphaz, and was from today's area known as southwest Jordan. Eliphaz, he emphasized that Job was a pretty bad guy. But he didn't stop there. He told Job that he should be happy. Be happy that God's correcting you. Wow, what words of encouragement when a person is down and out. He also, Eliphaz's counsel to Job was, you better turn to God. What words of encouragement to a man who was down and out like Job? Well, Job, we also found out that Job asked some questions. Some of the questions that Job asked was, have I sinned? You see that in Job 7 and verse 20. But Job didn't stop there. Oh, by the way, have you ever asked yourself that question? Or pondered the thought? He also said, what have I done to you? Speaking to God. I guess that was emphasizing some bitter frustration on his part, or misgiving, not understanding, why am I going through what I'm going through? But he also says, why have you set me as your target? Verse 20. But what we can see here, we have a little bit of an insight as to how Job must have felt amidst his trials. Yet we know that he was greatest among all the men of East, and he found great favor in the eyes of God. But look at how what he's asking God. It's almost like he's saying, why me? What have I done to deserve this? Why am I in the crosshairs of your scope? Well, that's where we were. He also said, why do you not pardon my transgression? Well, as we know, there were no transgressions to pardon, but Job must have felt that God was aware of something that he wasn't. So, Father, why don't you pardon me? Why don't you pardon my transgressions or my sins? Well, let's go on into today, and today we're going to have the second dialogue the first dialogue with Job's second friend. The second friend had the name of Bildad, and we find that Bildad was a Shuhite from Shua. And we're going to be starting in chapter 8. We are in Job chapter 8, if you want to turn there to this evening. Well, we find that Bildad was a Shuhite from Shua. Very interesting place, because Shua was a member of the Arabian nomadic tribes. And these Arabic tribes, they wandered near the land of Uz, not Oz, near the land of Uz, on the east side of the Euphrates River. Well, here's a map of that area, and there's a green arrow that shows you where Uz is, or was. Well, that's hard to say. Uz was and is. That's where Uz was. And the Euphrates was way over here between the Tigris, right in the land of the area that is known as Mesopotamia. The cornerstones of civilization. So you can see, if you look at where the red arrow is, over to where the green arrow points, that's quite a journey. As a matter of fact, you can take notice, you'll see that Shinar is just to the northwest of the Persian Gulf. And if you go all the way to the left-hand side of the map, the water that you see in the lower left-hand corner is the Red Sea. I have made that journey in truck, and it took 2 days. And that's a long journey. That is a very long journey. I made that journey escorting some missiles. I was the guy that had to be the American representing Raytheon and made sure the missiles got from point A to point B. That's a very tough way to travel. But I traveled on the road. They didn't have roads back then. What we find at Bildad, we're going to find as we begin reading in chapter 8, 9, and 10, specifically chapter 8, which is where what he decides to lock and load and say what he has to say to Job. He attributed Job's misery to wickedness, the wickedness of Job. Well, now let's go and see what he had to say. Here's Bildad's dialogue with Job, and it's Job chapter 8, verses 1 through 22. So I'm going to just pick a couple of verses here and see what they have to say. But he says in verse 2, it's kind of like he says, how long will you speak these things to God? We'll tell him, saying that Bildad was there when he heard what Job was saying in the first dialogue that he had. Like he was shocked. Why are you going to talk to God this way? How long are you going to do it? And then he goes on to him, he says, in your words, in verse 2, he says, your words are like strong wind. Well, I think we're somewhat familiar with what strong wind is like here in Oklahoma. But he doesn't stop there. He says, does God subvert judgment? Or does he pervert justice? Wow. Chapter 8, verse 3. Boy, he's really getting on Job's case, isn't he? But he doesn't stop there. He says in verse 4, if your sons sinned, God cast them away for their sins. Where is the compassion here for losing your family? But I thought it was nice of him to say if. There was a condition. He wasn't sure, but he said, if your sons sinned, God cast them away for their sins. Another condition, he says in verses 5 and 6, look at this. If you earnestly seek God with supplications, and if you are pure and upright, God will prosper you. Well, I'm pretty sure that Job was pretty familiar with what prosperity was. Especially since there was no man who had more than he had when he was blessed before Satan took it all from him. Now, can you put yourself in Job's place? Having gone through what he had gone through, now sitting there in the dirt with boils from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head, and having someone talk to you like this? Dayton.
I don't know in regard to verse 4, in regard to the word if. In Greek, there are two different conditional sentences. It's like eon with the subjunctive meaning to case not settled. But then if it's the indicative, it means it's settled. Like a parallel would be when the devil came to Jesus and said, if you are the Son of God, command these stones. Well, technically, the grammatical construction he used there is, since you are the Son of God, then you do this.
He,
And
he,
he's just trying to goose Christ over his power and get him to act. Well, just think, in Hebrew, I don't even know if they have a parallel, not that I know of. But if he were to say, since your son sinned against him, that would sure enough rub you wrong. If your children you thought maybe had generally been well, for him to come along now in the accusation and indicate condemning the children, just like he's condemning Job, because he must be wicked because of his suffering. I'm just saying the word since could be there in the place of if, since your children sinned against him, would be a pretty blunt statement. I don't know if is the proper translation, I'm sure of that, but you can put that connotation on the sense, just like the devil did with Jesus. And I've heard even more when we talk about your children like that.
well, actually, because it's very strongly implied in the way he's saying this.
In the context.
Imagine, you were going through some tough times, and besides that, you lost a son or you lost a daughter. Someone comes up to you and say, well, they got what they deserve since they sinned. How would that make you feel? As Dayton has pointed out to us, we can only begin to imagine how Job must have felt. Well, let's go on a little bit further. Dialogue with his Bildad also says, we were born yesterday. Know nothing. Gee whiz. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. Job, the writings of antiquity say that he was a judge. Wow. He must have known a little bit. Must have had a little bit of wisdom. Here his friend is looking at him in his downtrodden state, and he's saying, we were born yesterday and we know nothing. And he goes on and on and on after that, verse 5. Verse 13, he says, so are paths of those who forget God. You see what he is implying here? Job, you forgot all about God. Then he says, the hope of hypocrites will perish. What in the world do you suspect that Bildad is implying here? The slide before this, the last line also says Bildad was saying that Job was a wicked person. Well, if we see what Bildad's saying here right along the line, it goes along those lines. Let's see if we can't make it a little bit simpler. A little bit more simple. It's kind of like Bildad is saying, Job, that's a terrible way to talk. Is God ever unjust? Never. Well, he goes on to say, if you were pure and prayed to God, he'd surely pardon you. Wow. Have we ever pondered thoughts like that, or perhaps uttered those words? As we were beside the side of someone who was pretty much down and out, we wanted to make them turn to God. He said, just think back, Job. Just think back. Our fathers taught us that the man who forgets God is the one who fails. Well, Job just lost everything, and he must have felt like a failure as a father. He lost his family. He lost all of the livestock that he had, all of his home. And Bildad says, so you're bound to come out all right if you're upright. What a friend, huh? What a friend. I love this next statement. Today you might say, with friends like that, I'd hate to have friends. Well, Bildad pretty much locked and loaded, didn't he? Imagine saying things like that to a person who's down and out, to a person who he has just heard say, I wish I was dead. Better yet, I wished I had never been born. And then he comes before him and talks like this. Well, Job's a pretty good guy. Let's see how he responds to that statement of Bildad. Now, this is only the second dialogue in the book of Job. We actually have 7 of them, so we're going to take one a week. There we go. In verse 2 of chapter 9, Job says, I know what you say is true. He says, how can a man be righteous before God? Well, you know what? That's a pretty good question to ask ourselves. How in the world can any man or woman be righteous before God? Well, we know the answer to that to us today, but way back then, an answer to that question didn't even exist. As a matter of fact, they just felt like they were downright hopeless. Who is hardened against God and prospers? And he made, that is God, he made the bear, he made Orion, and he made the Pleiades. Well, those are constellations that you see in the heavens. Who are we to stand before him? And he goes on to say, who can say to him, what are you doing? In verse 12. What are you doing? I suspect that we've confined that Job was rather perplexed with the situation, had absolutely no idea what would have happened, what caused it to happen. But he said, God, what are you doing? And he goes on in verse 13, he says, God will not withdraw his anger. God will not withdraw his anger. He must have felt totally helpless. Has anyone here ever felt helpless? Has anyone here ever felt totally helpless? Boy, at a point in your life like that, you want to raise your hands up and say, I surrender. What else can I do? Job was really down and out. He said, how can I answer him? How can I reason with him? Referring to God in verse 14. He says, he multiplies my wounds. He doesn't even let me catch my breath. And he fills me with bitterness. Are you beginning to get a picture of how Job must have felt? We're seeing the human side of suffering. And when he said there that he fills me with bitterness, you know, sometimes when you're down and out, I mean, when things happen that you have absolutely no definition in your mind and your heart as to why it happened, you can't reason it. Bitterness is something that becomes a reality. That's an interesting word to do a Bible study on, or a word study on. Because bitterness is only from the devil himself. Did you say someone would say something? Don't raise your hand. Or wiggle your finger. Okay. Let's go on. He says, how can I answer him? How can I reason with him? Well, how can I answer God? How can I reason with God? He was desperate. Verse 14. But it doesn't stop there. He says, I will say to God, chapter 10, verse 2, and look what he says. Show me why. Show me why you contend with me. Why me, Lord? Why? Doesn't stop. He says, you know that I'm not wicked. Here we can see that the embedded implication of Bildad was that Job was a wicked man. Well, here he's saying to God, God, you know I'm not wicked. How can this guy Bildad be right? And he goes on, he says, you have granted me life and favor. And your care, look at this, your care has what? Preserved my spirit. Someone who is down and out, he looks back and he sees the blessings that God has given to him. And he becomes very much aware, even in his present condition, that God is preserving his spirit. Well, let's see if we can, okay. He said, leave me alone, that I may take a little comfort. Verse 20, and you look and see what follows. It says, leave me alone that I may take a little comfort. When or how or why? Look at this. Before I go to the place from which I shall not return. 20 and 21. He was at his last end. He was at his wit's end, the end of his life, and he felt, give me a reprieve, Father. Give me a little comfort. Give me a little comfort before I leave this world and go to the place from which I will never return. Well, let's see if we can simplify what he said. Going back to the beginning, he's telling Bildad, he says, I know what you're saying is true. But he says, how can anyone really have any standing with God? He's so far above us. What can I say to him? How can I reach him? God is so far above us. Do you see a little glimmer of the hope and the beautiful glory that we have in Jesus Christ? Bildad had none of that. He had none of that. He goes on to say, I wish I could. I wish I could plead my innocence in some court. Kind of implying that he was pretty familiar with the court environment. But who's going to judge between me and God? Wow. I say I'm righteous, but God still afflicts me. Well, you know, we have a mediator. We have a blessed mediator. One who mediates for us. He lives within us. He's our helper, our comforter. The Holy Spirit pleads our case. He goes on to say, and no one can judge and no one can make him stop whipping me. God is God. He's so far above me, I can't even talk with him. He says, I wish I could die. Doesn't stop there. He says, God, cut it out. I didn't do anything. Show me. Show me where I've sinned. You know I'm not wicked. Wow, he's about as pouring out his heart as much as he can to God after his friend accused him of unbelievable wickedness. He says, if I were, I'd deserve punishment. That is, if I were a sinner, if I had sinned. But I don't. Why did you ever let me grow up to be mistreated like this and then just die? We're seeing a person here in a position of desperation, hopelessness, and just wanting to give up life. Have you ever been there? Perhaps you have known someone who has been there. You know, God is here to help us in every situation that life brings our way. But oftentimes our upbringing gets in the way. What do you mean, John? Have you ever been taught just reach down, pull yourself together, pull your bootstraps together, pull your bootstraps and pull them up? You can do it. When the going gets tough, what's the rest of that saying? Tough, get going. Many times in our lives, we just feel as though we're alone. Heard your friend of mine in foxholes of Vietnam says he got his draft noticed when it was delivered to him. He opened it up and says, "You have been chosen by your friends and neighbors." And he looked around and said, "Friends? Neighbors?" Yeah. Sometimes we feel like nobody cares. Job must have been experiencing that exact thing. Oh, I have three friends that have gone. Oh, I had one talk to me. Said, "No, I don't know if you feel good." And then the second friend goes, as he comes, he says, "You're nothing but wicked." Do you think these friends of Job had intended in their lives and their hearts to hurt him? That's a good question. They may very much have been really trying to hurt him and help Job make some changes in his life and perhaps brought along in this situation. Bill, that says you're wicked. Your son's in sin. But when we go to be with the side of someone who is suffering, we may approach them and we look at them and say, "Oh, I'm suffering." Many people want to put on a facade. Face it. All pride. You don't want someone to know that we aren't really what we appear to be. We're really hurt. I think a classic case of that is someone who is struggling with a debilitating condition of depression. Never going anywhere. Oh, you really want to see someone who may be so struggling with depression. Yes, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. We need to be able to get past the facade. I had to preach in our things just for me. When it comes to parking, and he says, "We all put on masks." Yes, I think that the one that goes through doing that from time. He says, being in Christ, no matter where we are, we need to reach down in here. He said, "But you are at risk." I said, "Okay, Mark, what risk will I have?" He like that, really, you over here, you over there. He says, "People might not like what they see." But you know, there's more truth in that than we realize. When the struggles of life come our way, when we feel as though the walls are collapsing on us or the roof is falling in, may we never give up on our Lord. Here's something to ponder. nothing bad, nothing evil, nothing corrupt comes from above. So if the situation that we find ourselves in from time to time falls in that category, or you can name whatever the circumstance to describe the environment would be, let's never give up on God. The wisest man that ever lived, Solomon, it's recorded in Proverbs 20. Oh goodness, I forgot. I'll quote it. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. Acknowledge him, and here's a precious promise. He will, some versions say he shall, direct your path. Job may not have known it at the time, and we in times of distress may not know it either, but God is holding us in the very hollow of his hand. He will never leave us, and he will never forsake us. Well, how does God know I hurt when I hurt? We have a paraclete. The very divine nature of God, the Holy Spirit, lives within us, who was given to us as a present, as a gift when we obeyed the gospel. And he bears witness with our spirit, your spirit and my spirit, that we are who we are. But in so doing, do we realize he knows not only when I hurt, how I hurt, where I hurt, and what is the magnitude of that hurt? And Jesus told you and me and everyone else that before he left, he said, it's to Larry's advantage that I go. And you know his disciples may not understand. But he said it's to your advantage that I go so that the Holy Spirit can come. God knew before the creation of time, when he created the earth, that we will be known 24/7 when we want to be done with God. So he says, Kevin, if you send out to him, you know he's never not been there. He said he's your helper. He said he's your comforter. If you do a little bit of analysis of the word, you also find out that he is your counselor, as well as your consoler. How often is it I am good, I am Job is a living example, or it is a biblical example that we really can't realize. So let us humble ourselves and ask the Lord to continue to help us. As the Holy Spirit should help us. As our helper. And as our comforter. Even in this trial like Job's going through. I know that there are those of you that have gone through horrific situations. You need prayer.
From the divine side and the help that God is able and willing to give, back to the Bildad side of how we might be in a hospital room. Here's a group of statements that the patient wouldn't want to hear from us. Some of them a little bit comical, but it'd be easy to say the wrong thing sometimes when we're trying to do what Bildad was claiming to do to help Job. A statement like, wow, look at all the flowers in here. Looks like you're getting ready for a funeral. That would encourage somebody. I've just got a second to say hi. Who's your doctor? Did you check him out? That's something the patient doesn't need to hear. Did you know that massive doses of vitamins prevented this? And then, it sure is hot in here. I'll tell the nurse to adjust the thermostat. just sitting around out there. I've never seen you with your hair not combed and without makeup. You don't mind if I sit on the bed, do you? I'd give you a hug, but I'm afraid I'd get sick. I'd have come sooner, but I didn't know you were this bad. Well, at least you don't have as many stitches as my grandmother did. Eat. Don't you want to get out of the hospital? And then there was another one up here. Hospital food is always terrible. Is what you had done considered minor surgery? My cousin had the same surgery and he never even took a pain pill. I don't want to philosophize, but it could always be worse. I'm sure you don't need anything from me, but you call me if you do. Just say some things sometimes are not
Would
good.
we like to have a copy of that? Yeah, that is wonderful. Perhaps something to conclude the lesson tonight. Perhaps something we need to ponder. And that is when we go forward to see someone who really does need to be built up and encouraged. I hate to say it because it comes out wrong usually every time I say it, but let's think about the words we say before we say them. Perhaps switch our place. In college, I used to teach speech, and I used to teach writing and communications. And this was something a man much wiser than me told me one day. He said, you know, it doesn't matter the message that you send. What really matters is the message that's received. Many times what we say and what we mean are not necessarily the same thing. May we take to heart the suffering and struggling that Job is going through. May we learn from men like Bildad, friend, and think about words that can really encourage and build up a friend, a family member, a brother or sister in Christ who's really down and out and may feel that no one cares. That must be the way in which Job felt after talking with Bildad. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We're about 3 minutes short of the time period. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they'd like to add? Because that's wisdom. That was great wisdom from Dayton. Yes, sir.
Something is terrible that happens, we try to wrap our head around it and come up with make some sense out of it. And sometimes there is no sense to be made. There is no answer. We don't have all the information or whatever. And the best we can do is just let each other know that we're there for each other. And maybe that's what these two guys are trying to do, but sometimes we try to make sense or give answers to someone, and there isn't any. It's just
Fantastic words of wisdom.
we try to help. We mean well, but we try to give the wrong words.
There's two little words that mean a lot. You put your arm around someone, just say, I'm sorry. That implies a lot. Shows you care. And then peek up on your perception, what you perceive. don't ask them, do you need anything? Be alert, and if you see something that they need, next time bring it back and just give it to them. Because pride gets in the way, even of a sick person. Really, really does. Excellent words, outstanding words of wisdom. Too often, there's nothing we can say, but we can hug them and maybe just squeeze just a little bit. Thank you. Next week, we'll have week number 5, and we'll look at Job's third